Welcome to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Sherry Heinisch, also called the Supply Chain Queen, and joined with co-host James George. Today, we're exploring what it takes to truly build a regenerative work system. And this answer requires bridging two powerful knowledge systems: indigenous wisdom, so think about community, resilience, long-term stewardship, and millennia-old wisdom, living in balance with nature, and another knowledge system, modern workplace. Data, AI, analytics, digital transformation in the future of work. Our guest, Namoon, embodies this bridge. Combined with her expertise at MIT and her training as a fellow in supply chain management, leadership roles spanning consulting, corporate operations at Amazon, Namoon will show us how indigenous wisdom and modern skills together can create transformation that neither can achieve alone. And without further ado, let's begin.
Hello.
It's so good to see
So
you
good
and
to
hear
see
you.
guys. Nice to meet you, James.
Yeah, likewise. We clearly all got the memo about the black top, so that works.
We did.
This is the second episode in a row where we're all twinning.
Yeah.
Amazing. I've been wanting to share your story, Namoon, for a while, and I told James a little bit about you, but it's just a real privilege to be able to host you today.
Thank you so much for having me and for thinking of me.
I'm just super looking forward to the kind of blend of how things used to happen versus today's modern technological world, and you know, how do we smash those two things together? Because it seems like lots of examples in 2025. Well, we've just forgotten a lot of things that people used to know.
Remembering who we were. And I think on the heels of COP30 ending, the recognition first as nature, land, biodiversity, oceans as a stakeholder and an entire system that we must acknowledge. And then also the representation from indigenous peoples at COP30. The timing of this episode, I think, is ideal as well. So we can bring it together and supply chainify it. So, Namoon, before we get started, if you could just give folks a brief introduction about your origin story, and over to you.
I guess quick summary. I was born and raised in Mongolia. It's a culture that's deeply communal, shaped by the natural world. So growing up, you learn quickly that your well-being really depends on the well-being of the people around you and the nature around you. I think you learn to listen, to collaborate, and to persevere through the seasons. It's a very rash climate, tough climate. And so perseverance is definitely one of those values that became part of everyone, right? And every kid as they grow. So I think these values have become part of how I see systems and leadership. So when I came to the States for college, I studied international economics, started my career in consulting. I worked across heavy industry, logistics, procurement. I loved solving complex problems, but I think I wanted a deeper technical skill foundation, which led me to MIT for my master's. And I was fortunate enough to join their supply chain management cohort, and that's where I learned to model networks, work more deeply and more rigorously with data, think in terms of systems and constraints. And since then, I've worked across very different contexts. So in startups, I've led sourcing and supplier development. At Amazon, I've worked on packaging sustainability, network design, across logistics and middle mile. And then most recently, procurement decarbonization. So building tools and training that help thousands and thousands of our internal supplier-facing teams, as well as our suppliers, make carbon-aware decisions. And most recently, I'm now leading the eyewear category at Amazon Retail US, where I'm responsible for the P&L and work very closely with supply chain, with marketing, with our vendor partners to grow the business. So I think I've noticed something pretty consistent, right? The Mongolian worldview that I mentioned earlier that I grew up with, I think the sense of interdependence, stewardship, problem solving through dialogue pairs naturally, I think, with an analytical and technical training that I've gained later on. And one that helps me, I think, understand people, relationships, long-term impact. And the other helps me design those mechanisms and make decisions with data. And I think together they shape how I lead today, whether it's working with suppliers, like I've mentioned, or building new programs, or operating a retail business.
Wonderful.
Incredible.
James, don't you just feel relaxed now?
I mean, you're probably one of the most softest spoken guests that we've had on this series, but I don't think that takes anything away from your gravitas.
Well, James, funny you mentioned, I just interjecting here. My name does mean peace, Namoon. It means tranquility. There isn't really a
Mhm.
good English word for it, but it's sort of that mix between tranquility and peace. So when you think of a river, that's sort of the name that my dad thought of. He looked at the body of water and he said, that's the type of feeling that I get with my daughter. And so that's why I was named Namoon. So it's an adjective. So it's funny you say that because I've gotten the calm
Yeah.
response before.
But I wonder on that, Naveen, and I was curious when you were sort of painting that picture of your experiences across cultures and contexts. Does that give you an advantage? I think when we talk a lot about systemic change, people use the words, but don't necessarily connect all the dots all of the time. Do you think, given your experience, your journey navigating those contexts and those cultural differences, it has given you an edge on maybe some of your peers?
I will say that I think it has made me more empathetic or relatable. Maybe that's the better word.
And resilient.
Resilient.
You
Yeah.
don't give up. You don't. I mean, she does not give up,
Sure, he
which
knows.
is incredible.
Appreciate that. But I think the self-awareness that you build by being in a culture where you are asked to look inward, but also outward at the same time. Just to paint a picture, it's negative 40 degrees Celsius. That's when Fahrenheit and Celsius are the same. And you are still required to go to school. And so, you go out, your lashes freeze, your cheeks freeze, and by the time you're at school, everything's sort of half frozen, and then you defrost. In class, you have 5, 6 layers of clothing that you take off and you put away, and you make sure that you don't lose, because you don't have the same 5 layers of clothing to replace, later in the week, and so it's just kind of that resilient building from the weather and the climate. You get that. And of course, traditionally, if you think about nomadic lifestyles, it was very seasonal too, right? So spring was all about newness and warmth and growth, right? Versus fall was all about preparation. And winter was really hibernation, right? And protecting what you own and making sure that none of your flock froze to death. And so there was kind of this seasonal discipline. Some people call it seasonal apprenticeship, which is another way to look at it. And so it's kind of working with the seasons and the nature and kind of almost being one with how the seasons are changing and adapting to it.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there may be conflict in what we've just described in the origins of your culture and someone like Amazon. Like I can imagine there's a moment where the hard and fast P&L of a international global logistics company comes up against some of your beliefs and thoughts. So I wonder if we could, you've worked in consulting, you've led operations in a major company, you served on advisory boards. How do you bring those two worlds together? How do we blend that indigenous wisdom with modern capabilities to transform organizations?
It's a great question. I do think that they complement each other. So in some way, I disagree. I think
Good.
you
Disagree. We love when people disagree.
Disagree agreeably.
I think you learn to enhance one the other. I always hate the word balance, even with like balance of life. I think everything's a rhythm. Learn to adapt to that new rhythm. So a new role may have very specific metrics that, is priority, but then how do you then enhance that with ancestral wisdom or wisdom that we know, principles that we abide by, or value systems. And you learned through the land, through community, through stories, and of course through teachers and mentors. And it was all through poems and proverbs. And so you'd have your neighbor upstairs bump into you and give you a proverb. And then you go to school and there's a proverb written on their wall. After school, you're walking home, you bump into a stranger, they'll tell you a proverb about bumping into strangers or, learning to look ahead. So it was very poetic. Actually, a lot of the way that wisdom was shared, of course, very oral too. And I think later in my career, as I'm heading into the US and adding kind of these more modern systems thinking, analytical tools, I realize they're not really opposing knowledge systems. I think they do enhance each other. And I think before I go into that, maybe it might make sense to think of the 5 key principles that really guide at least how I work, right? So one is, I mentioned community interdependence as a key for nomads. So understanding that my well-being is tied to yours. Mongolians survive the steppe by relying on each other. And that, I think, lens helps me lead cross-functional work with the mindset of shared outcomes instead of individual wins. Second is relational governance. So the belief that dialogue is really the core operating mechanism. We have a proverb that says, people settle problems with the tongue, animals with their feet. And so
In the mouth or in the bum. But go ahead.
we're going to talk about
Sorry.
this.
It came out.
A little bit.
We'll go
I'll have to
back
edit
to
that bit
We'll
out.
go back to this.
Back
We'll
to
go
the
back to
tongue.
this. I think there's some very good historical examples of where the foot was used as well. I think the third principle is stewardship of nature and land, and you mentioned it. We talk about Father Sky or Tingri and Mother Earth. And when they say Mother Earth, actually, Mother Earth is also associated with water and the embodiment of water. There's a lot of historical references in Mongolian and Central Asian culture around Father Sky and Mother Earth and how, we basically abide by the rules of nature and therefore we are one with them and we need to be one with them. We don't take more than what the land can regenerate. And I think this principle sits underneath much of the work I've done recently and, in the past around sustainability, supplier decarbonization work and how we talk about it, that is this long-term horizon thinking and not just kind of the short-term win that, sometimes we're too fixated on. The fourth piece is around cultural grounding and identity. So what I mean by that is Mongolians really are tied to what we call nutuk, or the land we're from. If the nutuk is not well, then we are not well. And so there is a strong identity around who we are and that we're tied to the land or the people, the environment that we're from. And so it's really important that this principle carries through because I think there's this strength that comes from this connection. It's the principle that builds the operating mechanisms for companies. The strong tie and connection. There's this really great story from one of the queens in the past. Her name is Mandoche, and she captures a story about how a single stick breaks easily. And actually I was with her kids, so they were fighting and she said, okay, everybody take one stick and try to break it. Everybody breaks it. And then she gives a bundle of sticks and asks each of her sons to try to break it, and they couldn't. And so she was illustrating this idea that we're all one. And I think the fifth one is really about resilience. You had mentioned this, and I had mentioned this earlier too, about mental toughness of the nomadic people who move through seasons, right, and adapt constantly. So I think pair this with modern skills like problem framing, analytics, modeling, mechanism design, road mapping. I just think they make each other stronger. The Mongolian principles help me zoom out, understand the humans in the systems. It's very human forward in that sense, and then think longer term. I think the modern tools help me zoom in and build kind of a rigorous path to action.
I love it because I want to
Yeah.
jump in. So, principle 4, when you were describing cultural identity, really knowing who you are, what you believe, having a connection to your homeland or maybe even just family, the corporate archetype in itself can feel like a contradiction of principle 4. I mean, I'm just going to raise my hand. For a large part of my career, I wasn't sure who I was. And I was told, it was actually told to a lot of us, or we thought that we had to be like a certain leader or have certain skills or present ourselves a certain way in order to be accepted in the corporate archetype. So you see this thing in the back, being a rebel and being your authentic self and showing up and claiming that, I think that we still have a ways to go. So that the corporate archetype and sort of the system in which you fit, it might be in contradiction with principle 4 for a lot of folks who are listening right now. And that's okay, because the corporate archetype is broken. It's broken. And there are some companies that get it right. And you can tell because the word culture comes out. Culture, belongingness, inclusion, those things are really important. And they're actually tied to at least 3 of the 5 principles that you just shared with us, Namoon.
Yeah.
James, I know you're
I just,
brewing.
no, when you were just explaining the 5 principles, I was thinking, wouldn't this be brilliant as a kind of book for folks to kind of take the sort of learnings and use it in their own lives? But I guess as the white male, stale and pale member of this conversation, I think I have to be, very, very careful when I talk about culture. But I think on your point, Sherry, I wonder, we sort of tried to ask this a little bit just now, but when you meet folks like that and you have your worldview, how do you get them to align with how you want to proceed as a leader within an organization when you are met potentially against the traditional corporate types? How do you meet people where they are and take your cultural lens, take your approach to this topic and bring them on the journey?
A great question. I think I love what you say about meeting them where they're at. And I think that's actually a big part of that 4th principle I was just showing, that identity piece. I know when we talk about identity, it really talks about belonging and having a purpose, having a sense of self in a community. But there's a second part to that coin, which is more related to belonging, which is inclusivity, and actually accepting people for who they are and where they're at in their journey. Some of the things we learned about our history was the first law that was ever created by our emperor at the time was to ensure that people had the freedom of religion, because he was wise enough to see that was one of the main reasons, aside from women, why people fought and why there was so much fighting and wars all over the lands, and why tribes were separated and not united. And so this idea that recognizing kind of where the gaps are, where the weaknesses are, in that team member or in that organization, and being able to speak to those gaps, I think is what's important. And I think that story just really resonates with me, because he became stronger by enacting a law. And so he said everybody has the freedom to practice their own religion, which was very innovative at the time. That made the emperor stronger, because people now became loyal to him. And so I know there's like a very cliche saying in the English language, kill him with kindness. So just thinking about it in the modern world too, of how can we use our words and our conversations to move people? And I think it's building room and creating space for people to have an identity or to grow in their identity and purpose through conversation and dialogue.
Yeah. Amazing. And for some of the folks listening, I know they're probably nodding right now. I'm curious if we can just get super tactical for a second, just to give, and it can be you envisioning, it doesn't have to be like an example from your work, but what would be an example of something that someone in sustainability, supply chain, or technology could do to start the process of building regenerative work systems into their modern day? So you're honoring a lot of the knowledge that you've just unpacked with us, including the 5 principles, but you're actually applying it in the modern workplace. Is there an example, one thing you could do on Monday morning, or are there different metrics that would shape a new performance in the future of work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I guess if I think about what it might actually take for leaders to bridge Indigenous wisdom with the modern technical skills that we have, I think I mentioned the seasonality of nomadic life, right? Each season demanding a different skill, different responsibilities, different kind of interdependence. And I think leaders today also need that kind of seasonal way of learning, right? The first season's maybe grounding. There's a lot of great scholarly work about it, so I won't speak for them, but scholars in organizational culture or Indigenous wisdom, they've emphasized how knowledge begins with origin, knowing where you come from, what responsibilities you carry for leaders, right? Sherry, when you talked about organizations with a strong sense of culture. And so maybe before you touch any system, you understand your own worldview, biases, what values you bring into the work. I think the second season is likely relational capability. So adaptive leadership is one idea that was coined. I think Peter St. J is the author for one
I
of the
have the
books about
book.
systems as living communities rather than mechanical parts, right? So learning to really listen, building trust, reading the social architecture of a supply chain. Again, you really can't deploy modern tools, technology, really anything without the trust and cooperation of the stakeholders. And so I think the third is probably technical systems literacy, understanding how the tools work so that your decisions would strengthen the people involved. And then I think last is just integration through practice, right? And we when we think about, again, going back to that analogy of like seasonal discipline and seasonal apprenticeship, each season refines a judgment of somebody through real work, right? Whether that's herd grading, repairing, preparing for winter. I don't think there is one correct way to do things, again, because everyone lives in different seasons and in different environments and projects. And so, in operations, that might mean piloting tools with frontline teams, co-designing processes so that capability is actually growing with the technology and not in silos. Maybe if you're in consulting, that could mean building solutions with the people who will own them after you leave.
I'm looking at James because some
Yeah.
of the things that you're saying, Namoon, James has said. He has been beating the drum.
That's awesome.
And I'm just in my mind, I'm like, yep.
I think I could quite happily stand here and talk to you for hours, Namoon, because I feel
Yeah.
like I've found my spirit
person.
sister in
That's great.
the way that I do business, because it is that, right? And I don't come with the same heritage that you and the intentionality that you bring to this, but there is something very, very important for me about, we said it before, kind of meeting people where they are, helping to understand why they think about the problem the way they think about it, and then working alongside them and with them to find the solution rather than telling them what they need to do. Because if you do that, people don't embrace it or own it. And as soon as you stop talking, they forget it and walk away and get back to what they were doing before. So I think it's been fascinating listening to your sort of lens and your worldview. I do have one last question from my perspective, Cher. As we get to this stage of the year, thinking about the holiday season, thinking about kind of the new season, obviously we're in winter, but moving into the new year as well. That always for me feels like a logical psychological reset for a lot of people. What am I going to do differently in 2026? I guess, what are you hopeful for in 2026 when you think about all of the topics we've discussed here and the role you have here? And I think second to that, if you don't mind, as a parent, what are the things that you're hopeful for your children when you think about all of the challenges we face as a species and all of the technologies that we have that we know will solve those? What should we all be focusing on? What wisdom should we be taking forward into 2026?
We have the saying, "Mos katantran," which means even muddy water can put out fire. I'm hopeful that people are going to be progressing without waiting for perfection, without waiting for the perfect magical book or magical answer from ChatGPT on how they need to proceed.
We slinging the muddy water. What is the muddy water existing? Are we throwing it? What are we doing with the muddy water? Because my brain just exploded when you said that. I was like, even muddy water.
Puts out fire. Yeah, exactly. It's incredible.
It's perfection, progress over perfection. Every small, timely human action. Again, we're part of this interdependent network. Think about the supply chain, or just think about our communities. We're also connected. So any action that you take as a leader today strengthens or weakens the whole network. And so that's my hope, is that people start thinking about what they individually can be doing, and beginning with who else needs to be thriving for this work to succeed. I think that question widens the frame. Who else needs to thrive in order for this to succeed? I think it forces me, at least, to see the system the way that many indigenous cultures, including my own, have always seen it. Nothing stands alone, right? A good decision strengthens more than one node of the network. A good process builds capability, not just output,
Good.
right?
So good.
What else? And I think And I hope
We have 3 children, all of us.
Yeah.
yes.
And
Oh,
you're a wonderful mother, and we've been following each other on Instagram, so I see all the things that happen on the weekends, and she sees my things for years and years. So as a mother, like, how does this show up for you?
yeah, that's a great question. I think as a mother, education is really important and instilling values, indoctrinate from a young age. But really, it's sharing why the way that we live, why we choose to purchase certain things or not purchase certain things, right? I think it just shows up in everyday action. It's the classic, you know, do as I say, not as I do. Don't be that. Right. And I think I find myself pausing and saying, children are your reflection in many ways. Is this the right thing? Not just for me anymore, but also for my children. It's in the embodiment of that first principle of interdependence as a family unit. When, you know, cold season, if they're sick, we're all sick. It's just a cycle of, months of sickness. My kids are rooted and understanding that they belong to this world where our actions and individual actions affect my neighbor, affect their best friends. I meet people they don't even know on the street. And I think that's really important for me to know that that's something that they have learned and that they take with them. But I think secondly, just as a mother, everything that we do in the world we co-create is what they will be left with. And, and so it's really important that um, we actively take a part in ensuring that they have a world to live in.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. James, take us home. I feel so relaxed right now.
I know. I've been floating down the vernacular of Namoon for the last 45 minutes, and I'm ready to go to bed. No, I mean that was, I think that the as we said at the top of the conversation, it's really easy to think that we're reinventing new phrases and reinventing new ways of doing things that no one else has ever thought of. But in fact, we have forgotten more than we've learnt. And I think this conversation is one of those that just allows us to remember that we've done all right in the past, and we need to remember that, and we need to play that forward when we think about some of the really messy, sticky problems we have. Technology can enable it, but technology isn't wisdom. And that's what we need more of now than we ever have done.
Absolutely. Namoon, thank you so much for taking the time to share your story, your wisdom, your culture. Congratulations on your new role.
Thank you.
And I just love you. I'm a Namoon fan, and I cannot wait to see how your career unfolds and the impact that you continue to have on so many lives. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you, James.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.